In the scorching sun of ancient Persia, amid golden palaces and whispered conspiracies, one man's fate became a lesson carved into flesh and remembered for millennia. His name was Sisamnes, a judge, a man entrusted with the sacred duty of delivering justice in the name of a mighty empire. But when temptation knocked and gold clinked into his palm, Sisamnes made a decision that would not only cost him his life, but transform him into an eternal symbol of what happens when justice itself is betrayed. In a time when kings ruled by divine right and justice was seen as an extension of the king's will, corruption wasn't just immoral, it was treasonous. And King Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, would not allow treason to fester inside his courts. What followed wasn't just execution, it was theater, it was ritual, and it was punishment so brutal that its image still haunts art galleries and historical texts to this day. But why did Cambyses order the judge to be skinned alive? Why was that skin stretched over a chair and presented to his son, the next judge? And what does this tale say about the role of justice, both in the ancient world and today? In this video, we're not just telling the tale of a judge who died in agony. We're uncovering the deeper truths behind it, exploring the architecture of ancient power, the psychology of punishment, and the disturbing ways that justice and brutality have been entwined throughout history. If you think this is just a story from the past, think again. In a world still grappling with judicial misconduct, police overreach, and government corruption, Sisamnes' fate is more relevant than ever. Let's journey back to the ancient city of Susa, to a courtroom filled with whispers where justice took a terrifying new form. To understand the horror of Sisamnes' punishment, we need to first understand the sacred duty he violated and the society that entrusted it to him. 1.1 The Persian Empire, Power and Order. At its height, the Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. Stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west, it was a mosaic of languages, faiths, ethnicities, and local traditions. To rule such a vast territory required more than soldiers and taxes. It required systems that created trust and enforced unity. One of those systems was justice. The Achaemenid kings, particularly Cyrus the Great and his son Cambyses II, emphasized the idea that royal authority was not just absolute, it was divinely sanctioned. Inscriptions and royal decrees spoke of kings chosen by Ahura Mazda, the chief Zoroastrian deity, to rule wisely and justly. So for the empire to endure, the people needed to believe in the fairness of the law. And who carried out that law? Judges like Sisamnes, 1.2 judges as pillars of the state. Unlike the modern Western model where judges are elected or appointed by legal bodies, Persian judges were royal agents. Their role was not just legal, it was political, moral, and symbolic. Moral function judges were seen as custodians of royal justice. Their decisions reflected the will of the king and the moral order of the state. Political function. By arbitrating disputes between nobles, merchants, and provinces, they maintained the fragile balance that held the empire together. Administrative function judges helped enforce taxation, monitor local governance, and suppress rebellions through legal means before force was needed. These judges were often chosen from the elite nobles, educated scribes, or warriors turned bureaucrats. Their status was immense. A favorable ruling from a judge could mean land protection or elevation in court circles. A negative one could mean financial ruin or exile. In a world without a constitution or parliamentary checks, the judge's word was often final. That made them powerful. And power, as history shows time and again, breeds temptation. 1. Corruption in the ancient world. The temptation to take bribes, show favoritism, or manipulate rulings wasn't new even in ancient times. Despite the ideal of incorruptibility, the real world presented complications. A noble might offer gold for a favorable outcome. A regional governor might threaten retaliation if a judge ruled against him. A judge might weigh his own safety or political future against the letter of the law. Persian kings knew this. That's why they surrounded the judicial process with layers of surveillance. Scribes recorded proceedings. Local informants were encouraged to report abuse. Trials were often public not just for transparency, but as a form of deterrence. However, even the best systems fail when people in key positions lose their integrity. That's what happened with Sisamnes. 1. Farfor, who was Sisamnes Herodotus, the Greek historian, writing in the 5th century BCE, is our primary source for the story. According to him, Sisamnes had been a judge for many years. He had earned the trust of the royal court. There's no indication that he was known for cruelty, foolishness, or even ambition. On the contrary, he was likely seen as stable, experienced, and loyal. But that changed when a high-stakes case landed on his desk, a land dispute between two powerful nobles. The case was important enough to spark interest, but not so large that the king himself would usually intervene. One of the nobles, realizing he had the weaker argument, approached Sisamnes privately and offered a bribe. It was a familiar scenario across ancient history, a mix of wealth influence and quiet pressure. Sisamnes gave in. Why? Maybe he thought the king wouldn't notice. Maybe he justified it to himself as harmless. Maybe it wasn't the first time, but this time someone was watching. 1.5. The role of the scribe justices, hidden ally. In ancient Persian courts, scribes were more than note-takers. They were bureaucrats, spies, and sometimes whistleblowers. Their loyalty wasn't always to the judge. It was to the royal house. And in this case, one scribe noticed something was off. Herodotus writes that the scribe, possibly a young man loyal to the losing noble, recorded the details of the trial, carefully gathering evidence that the ruling was biased and unjust. He then took this information directly to Cambyses II, who had just returned from a military campaign in Egypt. This small act of defiance changed everything. 1.6. Cambyses II, the king with fire in his eyes. Cambyses was not his father. Cyrus the Great had been a unifier, a builder, and a relatively tolerant ruler. Cambyses was more severe, driven by ambition, and eager to prove himself as a ruler who would not tolerate weakness or disloyalty. When presented with the evidence of corruption, Cambyses didn't see it as just a rogue judge accepting gold. He saw it as a challenge to the very moral foundation of his empire. A kingdom built on justice could not survive if its judges could be bought. So Cambyses made a decision. He would not just remove Sisamnes. He would make him an example so unforgettable no future judge would dare follow his path. That leads us into one of the most disturbing punishments in ancient history, not because of the pain it inflicted, but because of the message it sent. 2.1. The moment of betrayal. Sisamnes' decision to accept a bribe was not merely a lapse in judgment, it was a betrayal of everything his position represented. In modern terms, it would be the equivalent of a Supreme Court justice secretly accepting money to favor one party over another in a landmark constitutional case. But in ancient Persia, where the king's justice was viewed as an extension of divine will, this was even graver. The noble who bribed Sisamnes was playing a risky game, and the one who lost, wronged, and humiliated made sure the scales of justice were restored, not with revenge, but with revelation. The scribe who reported the incident to the king played a role that echoes through history, the whistleblower. While the term is modern, the act is not. From the courtiers of ancient dynasties to employees in corporate boardrooms today, those who speak truth to power often change the course of history. 2. 2. The scribe's courage. It's worth pausing to consider this figure, the unnamed scribe. In a deeply hierarchical society, defying a judge was dangerous. The scribe risked his life. But he also understood something essential. True justice requires courage, even when that means challenging authority. Cambyses, upon hearing the scribe's report, didn't dismiss it. He called for records, interrogated other witnesses, and demanded written testimonies. The case against Sisamnes was quickly confirmed. Some historical interpretations suggest Cambyses may have already been suspicious of judicial misconduct. The scribe's report might have been the confirmation he needed to act decisively and symbolically. 2.3. The arrest and public trial. The arrest of Sisamnes was not done in the shadows. The king made sure it was public, intentional, and theatrical. He summoned the royal court nobles, foreign dignitaries, merchants, and scribes. Everyone who had ever watched Sisamnes preside now watched him stand as the accused. The irony was searing. For decades, Sisamnes had questioned others, issued punishments, lectured on justice. Now he stood trembling before the same throne he once represented. His sentence would not be read by another judge, it would be declared by the king himself. 2. 4. Cambyses speaks. There is no surviving transcript of what Cambyses said that day, but based on accounts by Herodotus and scholars of Persian law, it's likely he delivered a speech meant to sear itself into the memory of all who heard it. Modern scholars speculate it might have gone something like this. This man who sat in judgment over others has judged falsely. He took gold in exchange for truth, favor in exchange for fairness. Let all who wear the robe of justice look upon him, and remember in this court the law is not for sale. In this kingdom, justice is not a tool of the powerful, it is sacred. This wasn't just about Sisamnes. Cambyses was shaping his rule. He was declaring through this punishment that his justice would be incorruptible and that the empire's foundation would not rot from within. 2.5. The sentence. Then came the sentence, flaying alive. Why flaying in ancient Persia? Flaying was used not just to punish, but to symbolize the removal of falsehood, the stripping away of the outer layer to reveal the truth beneath. It was reserved for traitors, rebels, and those whose crimes undermined the moral integrity of the state. But Cambyses added a cruel twist. Sisamnes' skin would not be discarded. It would be processed, preserved, and nailed to the chair where his son Otans would sit as his successor. This was no longer justice, it was a lesson carved into flesh. 2.6. The symbol of the chair. What did it mean to sit on the skin of your father? In Persian thought, symbols carried immense weight. Royal rituals were filled with layers of meaning. Chairs in particular symbolized authority. They were not merely places to sit, they represented roles, identities, and power. By covering the judge's chair in human leather, Cambyses sent a message that was impossible to ignore. Justice must be grounded in memory. Painful memory. Otans would not simply inherit the job, he would inherit the burden. Every day he entered the courtroom, he would be reminded by sight, touch, and smell of what happened when justice was sold. 2.7. Was the punishment justified? Modern minds recoil at the barbarity. Flaying is an excruciating death. Even among brutal ancient punishments, it stands out for its cruelty. So the question arises, did the punishment fit the crime? There is no easy answer. Cambyses wasn't operating under modern ethical frameworks. His primary goal was deterrence through spectacle. In a world without mass media or widespread literacy, public executions were among the few ways to send a message. And while we can and should condemn the method, we must acknowledge its effectiveness. There is no record of any judge in the Persian Empire repeating Sisamnes' mistake during Cambyses' reign. Fear is a brutal teacher, but an efficient one. 2.8. The psychological toll. Sisamnes' story doesn't end with his death. It continues in the mind of his son. Imagine Otans walking into the court for the first time, greeted by the same faces that watched his father die. Imagine the weight he carried, not just the responsibility of justice, but the burden of legacy. Herodotus tells us Otans served loyally. He later became a satrap governor of Ionia, a position of great prestige. But the trauma must have left a mark. Every judgment he rendered was measured against the standard his father failed to uphold. His story is a study in psychological endurance. Was Otans motivated by fear, by duty, or by a desire to redeem his family name? We'll never know for certain. But his compliance suggests he understood the importance of his symbolic role. Summary of Part 2. Sisamnes' bribery wasn't a personal flaw, it was a systemic failure. A scribe risking everything exposed the truth. Cambyses turned the trial into a spectacle of royal justice. The punishment of flaying and the reuse of Sisamnes' skin created a lasting symbol of anti-corruption. Otans inherited not only his father's position, but also the moral burden of his failure. 3.1. Turning the courtroom into a stage. When King Cambyses II summoned the royal court for the trial of Sisamnes, it wasn't simply to adjudicate a legal matter, it was a calculated act of political theater. This was a performance with one goal: to shock the system back into obedience. For a king still solidifying his rule, the courtroom would become a stage. The script, a betrayal of justice. The protagonist, a judge now judged. And the audience, the powerful elite who would carry Cambyses' legacy into the future. The trial was a masterclass in symbolic governance. No detail was accidental. Foreign diplomats, royal administrators, elite merchants, scribes, and military commanders were summoned. They watched not just to witness, but to absorb a message. The message was clear: no one, not even a high judge, was above the king's justice. 3. Secular due process, royal-style Persian law. While absolute in the hands of the monarch was not without structure, The empire was proud of its administrative systems, many of which influenced later governments, including the Greeks and Romans. During Sisamnes' trial, witnesses were called. Evidence was presented, including written records, scribal notes, and perhaps even testimony from the bribing noble himself. But make no mistake, this was not an impartial trial by a jury of peers. Cambyses presided personally. His role was not that of a judge bound by law, but of a king bound by divine right. Sisamnes, facing a mountain of irrefutable proof, confessed. Perhaps he hoped for mercy. Perhaps he knew mercy would not come. His confession, instead of softening the king's wrath, served only to confirm Cambyses' worst fears. Corruption had breached the walls of royal authority. 3.3. The sentence more than execution. Cambyses' sentence was not merely death. It was death with intent. It was transformation through terror. The announcement was made in front of the court. Let the judge be skinned alive. Let the skin be preserved. Let it cover the seat of justice, and let his son sit upon it. It was brutal. It was unforgettable. And it was deeply political. The courtroom gasped. Some scribes trained to record every detail without emotion likely trembled as they wrote. In one sentence, Cambyses achieved three things. He punished the guilty. He warned the innocent. He preserved a symbol. This wasn't merely a punishment. It was an act of psychological warfare. It was a deterrent wrapped in horror. 3.4. The setup for execution. In the days that followed, the sentencing preparations for the execution began. It wouldn't happen in secret or at night. It was to be performed at the heart of the empire, at the center of public life, the royal courtyard. The ground was swept. A wooden table was erected. Braziers were prepared to heat water and sterilize flaying tools. Executioners were summoned, not average soldiers, but specialists in prolonging suffering while keeping the victim alive. Every detail was meant to heighten dread. By the time the day arrived, the entire city of Susa buzzed with the news. People gathered in silence, not in defiance, but in awe and perhaps terror. 3.5. The public display. On the morning of the execution, Sisamnes was led in chains before the court. Gone was the dignified robe of a judge. He stood in rags, trembling pale. His face, once the source of stern rulings and sharp words, now sagged under the weight of fear. He was placed on the wooden table. His arms were tied, his eyes wide. He may have looked to the crowd for pity, but none could give it. Many turned away. Some fainted. A few vomited. But no one spoke out. To do so would mean aligning with corruption. Even silence in the face of injustice in this setting became a form of complicity. Cambyses, seated high above the court, watched every moment. He wasn't a distant tyrant. He was an active architect of fear. 3.6. The anatomy of a spectacle. The Persian method of flaying was a grim science. Incisions were first made at key points along the back, chest, thighs, and arms. Hot water was poured to soften the skin, ensuring it could be removed in large sections. Spatula-like tools were used to lift and peel the skin, keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. The process could last hours. Every scream, every gasp, every convulsion was a sermon about integrity, a sermon about loyalty, a sermon about the terrible price of betrayal. In the heat and smoke of the courtyard, Sisamnes died not once, but in slow, unbearable increments. His body betrayed him, but his legacy had already been decided. His skin, once a human organ, now became parchment. Leather, symbol. 3.7. Creating the chair of justice. The flayed skin was not discarded. Persian embalmers skilled in preserving materials for ceremonial use treated the skin with salt and resins. It was dried, stretched, and tanned, using the same methods applied to animal hides. Once processed, the skin was affixed to the judicial chair, perhaps a high-back seat with armrests, symbolic of the authority a judge would carry. The flayed skin may have been cut to fit or draped as a warning. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Justice is watching. Kuchgat. The chair became not just furniture, but a shrine, a grotesque memorial, a reminder stitched in flesh. And then came the final stroke. Cambyses summoned Otanes, the son of Sisamnes. 3.8. A king's final lesson. In one of the most haunting moments in ancient political history, Cambyses is said to have spoken these words to Otanes. Remember always upon what leather you sit when pronouncing your judgments. This was no coronation. This was indoctrination. Otanes was not just inheriting a title. He was inheriting a curse, a test, and a ghost. From that day forward, every judgment he passed, every sentence he delivered, was in conversation with his father's sins. The chair beneath him whispered warnings. The court around him watched for weakness. Cambyses had reshaped justice not through reform, but through terror. 3.9. Fear as a tool of governance. We often talk today about judicial integrity in terms of ethics, oversight committees, and legal education. But for Cambyses, there was one tool more effective than any legal statute: fear. He didn't rely on scrolls or legal codices to ensure compliance. He relied on visceral memory, the kind of trauma that passes from one generation to the next, not through law books, but through lived experience. Cambyses may have ruled with iron, but he shaped the future with spectacle. His court would not forget, nor would any court after it. Summary of Part 3. Cambyses transformed the trial of Sisamnes into a public ritual of justice. Flaying was chosen not just for pain, but for its symbolic power, removing falsehood, exposing corruption. The execution was a demonstration of what happened when royal justice was defied. The transformation of human skin into a judge's chair created a legacy of fear-based morality. Otane's appointment was not a reward, but a burden, a daily reminder of justice's sacred weight. 4.1. Death as demonstration. In many ancient societies, death was more than a biological endpoint. It was a ritual, an ideological performance, and a message to the masses. For the Persian Empire, and particularly under Cambyses, two executions weren't just punishments, they were public pedagogy. The flaying of Sisamnes wasn't merely an execution. It was an allegory acted out in flesh. His body became a symbol, his suffering a sermon. In a time without viral videos, broadcast trials, or front-page scandals, spectacle was the only way to etch consequences into collective memory. Unlike decapitation or hanging, which offer quick deaths, flaying maximized public horror. Each phase of the execution was carefully calculated to imprint a lasting lesson on every viewer, particularly those in power. 4. 2. Why flaying a cultural and religious context. Flaying appears in multiple ancient cultures, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and later even the Romans. But its use was rare and reserved for crimes seen as cosmic betrayals, acts that tore at the moral structure of the universe. In Persia, flaying signified purification through exposure. It was believed that by stripping the skin, the outer deceitful shell, you revealed the corrupted soul underneath. Zoroastrian undertones may also be relevant here. Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion in Persia, was obsessed with dualities, light and darkness, truth and lie, justice and chaos. Sisamnes had aligned himself with the lie druge, a spiritual crime as well as a legal one. Thus his punishment had to not only satisfy royal justice, it had to rebalance the universe. 4.3. The Skin Chair. A monument to memory. The chair made from Sisamnes' skin isn't just a gruesome object, it's a semiotic powerhouse. It blends object memory, body, and message into a single unit. Imagine this: a courtroom lit by sunlight, walls lined with scribes. Otane seated in solemn silence delivering verdicts. Beneath him the preserved skin of his father, a human relic, a constant whisper. This chair wasn't merely symbolic. It was a mnemonic device, a tool of forced remembrance. It made forgetting impossible. In a society where oral tradition ruled and most learning was through visual or symbolic means, the skin chair functioned as living jurisprudence. It reminded everyone from new judges to nervous plaintiffs that corruption never disappears without leaving a mark. 4. The psychological warfare of authority. Cambyses wasn't merely punishing Sisamnes, he was creating trauma as a political tool. Trauma in this context becomes governance. Judges, fearing the same fate, rule more carefully. Nobles, knowing the court won't shield them, hesitate to push bribes. Citizens witnessing such events invest more faith in the fairness of the system. This isn't modern morality, it's ancient efficacy. And it worked. While we recoil at the barbarity, we cannot deny its psychological precision. Cambyses orchestrated a spectacle that rewired how law was viewed, remembered, and enforced. 4.5. Representation in Renaissance art. The horror of Sisamnes' fate outlived the Persian Empire. Nearly 2,000 years later, the Renaissance rediscovered his story and reframed it as a moral mirror for Europe. The most famous depiction is the Judgment of Cambyses by Gerard David, painted in 1498. This diptych, commissioned for Bruges Town Hall, shows on the left Cambyses sentencing Sisamnes. On the right, the judge being flayed alive limb by limb. In the background, a new judge, Otanes, sits on the now famous chair. Why would a European city decorate its civic chamber with such a gruesome image? Because they understood the same lesson Cambyses taught. The integrity of justice requires constant, painful awareness. Art became an extension of justice. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about caution. 4.6 Symbolism. Across cultures, Sisamnes' fate may be Persian, but its symbolism is universal. Other civilizations use similarly terrifying rituals to symbolize corrupted roles. Assyrians nailed the skins of rebels to city gates. Medieval Europe quartered traitors, scattering limbs across regions to deter uprisings. Imperial China practiced slow-slicing lingqi for crimes that betrayed the emperor. In each case, punishment wasn't private, it was performative. The body became a canvas for the state to paint its warnings. What makes the Sisamnes chair unique is its domestic intimacy. Unlike gates or spikes, a chair is sat upon. It's mundane, it's close, it forces proximity to legacy. The past is not on the wall, it's under your body. 4.7 The Legacy of Otanes. What of Otanes, the son Herodotus notes he became a provincial governor? This suggests he fulfilled his duties well and earned royal trust. But how did he cope? It's likely Otanes was forever shadowed by the grotesque inheritance. He was judged not just by his rulings, but by his reactions. Did he flinch when he entered the courtroom? Did he speak with measured tones, aware of every syllable? One can imagine him pausing before sitting, hand hesitating over the armrest, his mind flashing to the execution, the smell of hot water and torn flesh, the screams of his father echoing in the walls. Otanes' psychological endurance is a testament to the weight of inherited guilt and the moral cost of legacy. He became a living bridge between past and future. 4.8 A Mirror for Modern Society. What can we, in our age of courts, appeals, ethics boards, and legal watchdogs, learn from a tale this macabre? More than you might think. The story of Sisamnes forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that corruption is a timeless threat and that symbols, no matter how brutal, can be effective in forging ethical memory. In our era, we no longer flay judges, but we still build monuments, still prosecute high-profile cases publicly, and still make examples of those who betray public trust. The difference lies in method, not motivation. We seek transparency. The Persians sought spectacle, but the aim remains to protect the integrity of justice. Summary of Part 4. Flaying was chosen not just for pain, but for symbolic purification. The skin chair was a mnemonic tool, an object that merged justice and memory. Cambyses ruled through psychological trauma as much as through law. Renaissance Europe revived the story to reinforce civic duty and ethical leadership. The tale of Sisamnes echoes across time because it touches on universal themes: betrayal, punishment, and institutional integrity. 5.1 The Inheritance. No one once Otanes did not choose this legacy. He didn't ask to be thrust into the seat once occupied and now lined by the skin of his father. His appointment was both a punishment and a promotion. Cambyses ensured it would be the most psychologically loaded assignment in the history of Persian jurisprudence. Imagine the weight of that moment, the formal summons to appear before the king, the silence of the assembled court, the smell of the freshly treated leather, the subtle but suffocating presence of everyone's eyes. Otanes was told to take his father's place not metaphorically, but physically, to sit where the man who had failed had once sat, to pass judgment not from neutrality, but from a seat steeped in moral consequence, and to do it perfectly or risk repeating history. 5.2 Sitting on the Skin of Guilt. For Otanes, each day in court was a test of strength, emotional, ethical, and symbolic. He wasn't just a judge now. He was the son of the flayed, a living monument to both failure and redemption. How did he survive this impossible position? Most likely through rigid discipline. It's probable he became extraordinarily cautious, examining each case with obsessive precision. Harsh rulings. Some sources suggest he may have been unusually strict, perhaps to overcompensate for his father's disgrace. Silence Otanes is rarely mentioned outside this context, implying that he did his job without seeking personal glory. Perhaps that was intentional. Herodotus mentions that Otanes eventually became a satrap, a provincial governor. This wasn't just a bureaucratic title. Satraps wielded significant power. The appointment suggests that Cambyses or later rulers trusted him, indicating he proved himself worthy. But at what cost? 5.3 The psychology of legacy. In modern psychology, the phenomenon of intergenerational trauma refers to how the emotional wounds of one generation can imprint themselves on the next. Otanes is an ancient example of this. He inherited more than a job, he inherited shame, guilt, and a daily reminder of the high stakes of failure. His father's sins were literally beneath him. This burden likely produced one of three results. Paralysis. He might have become overly cautious, afraid to make bold decisions. Overcorrection, becoming a zealot for fairness, even harshly so. Redemptive drive, determined to restore his family's honor through quiet excellence. While we can only speculate, the fact that Otanes rose to govern a major province speaks volumes. He didn't crumble. He carried the weight and walked forward. 5.4 Hereditary justice. A blessing or a curse. Otanes' story raises larger questions about hereditary justice systems, where offices or roles are passed down from parent to child. This was common in the ancient world, from Persian judges to Roman senators, from Chinese magistrates to Egyptian priests. The logic was clear. The child had been exposed to the workings of power from a young age. Legacy created continuity. Loyalty could be trusted more in bloodlines than in strangers. But the risks were immense: nepotism, stagnation, emotional trauma, as in the case of Otanes. By assigning the son of a corrupt judge to replace his father, Cambyses weaponized heredity. He fused tradition with trauma to create a unique form of deterrence. It worked, but it also exposed the thin line between institutional loyalty and personal suffering. 5.5 Otanes' man, symbol or prisoner. Was Otanes free on the surface? Yes, he had authority, privilege, respect. But psychologically, perhaps not. Every ruling he passed, every sentence he handed down was shadowed by expectation. He didn't just represent the law, he represented penance. We often admire those who rise after a fall. Otanes had to rise inside the ruins of someone else's collapse and prove he wasn't doomed to repeat it. It's unclear whether he succeeded because of or in spite of his father's failure. But what is clear is this: he endured. And that endurance makes him just as much a figure of historical importance as Cambyses or Sisamnes. He represents something rare: the transformation of generational shame into public service. Summary of Part 5. Otanes was forced to inherit his father's role and his father's disgrace. The chair made from human skin turned his appointment into a psychological crucible. His career suggests he performed well, perhaps driven by a desire to atone. The story critiques the practice of hereditary justice, even as it exploits its symbolism. Otanes stands as a figure of endurance, carrying moral weight not of his making and turning it into legitimacy. 6.1 From history to canvas. 2,000 years after the death of Sisamnes, his story resurfaced, not in Persia, but in the civic chambers of Europe. During the Renaissance, as cities sought to solidify civil institutions and moral codes, the tale of the flayed judge became a visual warning and a tool of propaganda. It began not in a courtroom, but in an art studio. The most iconic rendering of the event is the Judgment of Cambyses, a diptych painted in 1498 by Gerard David, a Flemish master of realism and symbolism. Commissioned by the aldermen of Bruges, this piece wasn't for private enjoyment. It was designed to hang in the town hall where judges, clerks, and citizens would see it daily. This choice reveals something profound. The story of Sisamnes wasn't just historical, it had become a political instrument. 6. Gerard David's diptych, a visual breakdown. The painting consists of two panels. Panel 1, the trial. Cambyses, in full royal regalia, listens to the scribe's accusation. Sisamnes stands bound, wide-eyed, surrounded by courtiers. The room is richly decorated, full of Renaissance fashion and architecture, an intentional anachronism to make the story feel immediate to its contemporary audience. Panel 2, the execution. Executioners, calm and focused, begin peeling away the skin from Sisamnes' thigh and torso. His face is contorted in agony. In the background, Otanes takes his seat on the human leather chair, a silent echo to all who view it. It's important to understand that this is not just a morality tale. This was a civic commandment Be just or suffer the fate of the unjust. 6.3 Why choose this story? The city of Bruges, like many European city-states, struggled to maintain honest legal institutions during the 15th century. Corruption among magistrates and local nobility was common. By commissioning this painting, the city council warned judges not to abuse their roles. The public was reassured that their leaders valued integrity. A moral standard was made visible, visceral, and unforgettable. It was a Renaissance-era version of placing cameras in courtrooms or broadcasting trials on national TV, a tool to hold power publicly accountable. Sisamnes became a symbolic scapegoat, a reminder of what happens when trust is betrayed. 6.4 Other artistic representations. David's work wasn't the only interpretation. Other artists used the Sisamnes tale to explore justice and fear. Joachim von Sandrart, 17th century. His engraving shows a more graphic execution, focusing on the grotesque details of the skin being pulled away. The emotional expressions are exaggerated, emphasizing human suffering as divine punishment. William Isaacs's Van Swanenburg, 1600s, in his version, the act of flaying is framed like a theatrical play. Otan's is again seated in the background, and Cambyses watches stoically, reinforcing his role as divine arbiter. These pieces were used not only in town halls but in law schools, guild halls, and courtrooms. They served as tools of pedagogical terror, instructing viewers not with words but with blood and legacy. 6.5 Art as political messaging. Renaissance art wasn't just decoration, it was public messaging. In societies without mass media, art served as education. Most people were illiterate. Art taught through imagery. Control by depicting punishment graphically, rulers reminded citizens of their power. Propaganda city leaders used visual cues to strengthen moral legitimacy. Sisamnes' story fit all three purposes. It educated viewers on justice. It controlled behavior through fear. And it reinforced the narrative that corrupt judges were a danger to the entire state. 6.6 A Modern Resurrection, Moscow. 2012. In a surprising twist, the Sisamnes story reappeared in modern times, not in textbooks, but in political protest. During the 2012 Pussy Riot trial in Moscow, where several members of the punk activist group were prosecuted for anti-government performances, protesters brought reproductions of the judgment of Cambyses to the courthouse steps. Their message, justice in Russia, had been corrupted. Judges were acting not as independent agents, but as tools of state power. The story of Sisamnes, once a tool of state terror, had become a weapon of civic defiance. It was an astonishing reversal. The same image that once frightened judges into obedience was now being used to criticize those judges. In doing so, it proved the story's versatility and its enduring relevance. 6.7 What the art doesn't show. While Renaissance art captured the moral and visual weight of Sisamnes' punishment, it left out certain complexities. The emotional aftermath for Otanes, the long-term cultural consequences within Persia, the philosophical debate over whether fear is a legitimate basis for law. This simplification made the story more potent for its audience, but also more one-dimensional. The Renaissance wanted certainty, clear good and evil, justice and punishment. But in truth, Sisamnes' tale is ambiguous. His crime was real, but was the punishment just? His son rose in status, but did he ever sleep peacefully? The court was purified, but was it traumatized in the process? 6.8 Justice as performance art tells us something uncomfortable. Justice has always been performative. From ancient Persia to medieval Europe to modern courtrooms, justice is not just about verdicts, it's about theater. Robes, elevated benches, public trials, legal ceremonies. These elements serve to dramatize fairness. And when the system fails, society turns to symbolic acts, from flaying to televised impeachments, to restore that performance. Sisamnes, through both his punishment and his artistic resurrection, reminds us that justice isn't only what happens, it's how it's seen. Summary of Part 6. Renaissance Europe revives Sisamnes' story to enforce civic virtue and judicial responsibility. Gerard David's diptych immortalized the flaying as both moral instruction and political theater. Art turned a brutal execution into a daily warning for public officials. In modern times, the same imagery was used to protest perceived injustice, showing how symbols evolve. Justice across history has always involved performance, symbolic, emotional, and political. 7.1 Justice, then versus now. What has really changed? Sisamnes was judge flayed and turned into a warning for all time. But thousands of years later, we must ask, has justice truly evolved, or have we simply changed the methods of punishment? In the ancient world, justice was direct, visible, and public. Corruption was punished with spectacle. Authority was reinforced through fear. In modern democracies, justice is rooted in due process, checks and balances, transparency, rehabilitation over retribution. But despite these noble principles, judicial corruption still happens quietly, covertly, and globally. And while we no longer skin judges, we do destroy reputations, careers, and public trust. The story of Sisamnes remains relevant not as a literal guide, but as a metaphor for accountability and as a mirror of our legal hypocrisy. 7.2 High-profile judicial scandals in the modern era. Let's examine real-world cases that echo the corruption of Sisamnes minus the flesh and blood. 1. United States Kids for Cash Scandal. In Pennsylvania, 2008, two judges, Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan, were found guilty of accepting $2.6 million in kickbacks from private juvenile detention centers in exchange for sentencing minors to harsh punishments for petty crimes. Hundreds of children were affected. Families were devastated. The judges were eventually imprisoned, but only after years of unchecked abuse. Parallels with Sisamnes, a sacred duty betrayed. Justice sold for gold. Vulnerable lives destroyed. The difference, no flaying, but the public outrage and media shaming mirrored the ritual humiliation of ancient Persia. 2. Brazil Operation Car Wash Lava Jato. While this massive anti-corruption operation initially exposed politicians and business tycoons, it later revealed that judges and prosecutors manipulated trials for political purposes, most notably in the case against former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Private chats revealed bias, agenda-driven prosecutions, and collusion. The public began to question the entire judicial system. The judge at the center, Sergio Moro, later became a government minister, raising further concerns. Sisamnes echoes justice used as a weapon. Political power shielding judicial bias. Public trials doubling as propaganda. 7.3 Justice as spectacle in the digital age. In the Persian Empire, justice was a bodily spectacle. Today it's digital. Live stream trials, viral courtroom clips, Twitter-based verdicts, hashtag activism, justice for cases. The visual theater remains only now screens have replaced scaffolds. Take the Johnny Depp vs. Amber Heard trial 2022. While technically a civil matter, it became entertainment judgment and moral theater all at once. Viewers didn't just watch, they picked sides, spread memes, and delivered public sentences before the court did. Takeaway: the need for visible justice hasn't faded. It's just been reframed into the attention economy. 7.4 Corruption without consequence. When there's no Cambyses. Sometimes the problem isn't just corruption, it's the lack of accountability. In autocratic regimes, judges often act as rubber stamps for executive power. Consider Russia's judiciary under Putin, where opposition figures like Alexei Navalny face politically motivated trials with predetermined outcomes. China's people's courts, often guided by the Communist Party's interests, where dissenters and journalists are convicted with limited or no transparency. In such cases, the absence of a Cambyses figure, someone willing to punish corruption, leads to rot at the root. Justice becomes a tool of oppression, not order. That's the inverse lesson of Sisamnes. When there is no consequence, corruption flourishes. 7.5 Institutional memory, modern skin chairs. We don't flay people, but institutions still create symbolic reminders to enforce memory and integrity. Some examples: code of ethics plaques hung in courtrooms. Memorial walls listing judges who fell in service or disgraced themselves. High-profile resignations turned into warning tales for future appointees. In the U.S., the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act allows for complaints against federal judges. But cultural memory matters more than paperwork. In essence, modern legal systems still try to replicate what Cambyses did, make the cost of corruption unforgettable, but through press protest and public record rather than physical pain. 7.6 Law schools and the morality of power. Legal education today rarely invokes flaying, but the Sisamnes case is sometimes taught in ethics courses, not for its method, but for its lesson. Questions posed to law students include: what is the proper punishment for judicial betrayal? Can public humiliation serve a justice-enhancing function? Should symbolic justice be part of legal deterrence? In this way, Sisamnes lives on, not as a horror story, but as a case study. 7.7 The Metaphor of the Chair. There is perhaps no more powerful metaphor in this story than the chair, the object that was once furniture, then warning, then inheritance. Today, judges still sit on chairs. They're elevated, often polished, positioned to represent clarity and command. But now we ask, what do those chairs rest upon? Public trust, legal tradition, transparency, or do some rest like Otanes on a silent burden, a history of injustice not yet addressed? The chair forces us to think justice is not just about who sits in it, it's about what that seat represents. Summary of Part 7. Modern judicial corruption still threatens justice worldwide, but uses new tools and escapes older punishments. Sisamnes' story resonates through contemporary scandals, where judges betray trust for money or politics. Today, public shame resignations, viral exposure, and symbolic reminders take the place of physical punishment. The chair of justice remains symbolic, whether lined with skin or scrutiny. The story of Sisamnes is not about cruelty, it's about clarity. He was a judge, trusted, powerful, respected, and yet he sold truth for gold. Cambyses didn't flay him just to kill. He did it to warn, to remind everyone who dares to wear the robe of justice that with power comes profound responsibility. The skin chair is grotesque, but it's unforgettable. It forces us to consider, what should justice cost when justice is sold? We don't need to return to ancient punishments, but we do need to remember their purpose: to protect the people from those who use power for personal gain. In an age of complex legal systems, political entanglements, and viral misinformation, the story of Sisamnes remains one of the most powerful warnings ever told. Not because of what was done to him, but because of what he failed to do for others. So the next time you see a courtroom, a judge's robe, or a verdict read aloud, remember, somewhere in a kingdom long gone, a man sat on his father's skin and decided to do better. Let that legacy be a reminder: justice isn't inherited, it's earned every single day.